Snow crunches underfoot, a bitter wind howls across frozen fields, and the sun struggles to rise above a sky the color of iron. This wasn't just any winter, this was medieval Europe, where temperatures could plunge so low that wine froze in barrels, and the ground became as hard as stone. For farmers, the arrival of winter wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a battle for survival. Imagine waking before dawn to tend crops that refused to grow, knowing your family's very existence depended on the meager stores tucked away in your cottage. No supermarkets, no heating systems, no safety nets, just raw ingenuity against nature's harshest season. But here's the astonishing part: they didn't just endure. They thrived. Medieval farmers developed strategies so clever, so resourceful, that they turned the dead of winter into a time of preparation, community, and even celebration. How did they do it? How did they keep their livestock alive when pastures vanished under snow? How did they preserve food without refrigeration, or stay warm in homes with nothing but a hearth and straw insulation? The answers will surprise you, revealing a world where every scrap of grain, every knot of firewood, and every hour of daylight was a precious resource to be hoarded like treasure. This isn't just a story of hardship, it's a testament to human resilience. Behind every flickering candle in a medieval home was a farmer who outsmarted winter itself, using methods passed down through generations. Some of their techniques are so effective, they're still used by subsistence farmers today. So let's step into their world, where survival wasn't just about brute force, but about wisdom, teamwork, and a deep understanding of the land. By the time we're done, you'll never look at a winter morning the same way again. Picture a world where winter wasn't just a season, it was a siege. In medieval Europe, temperatures could plummet so drastically that rivers froze solid enough to support markets and sleighs, while the Thames regularly turned into an icy highway. This wasn't just cold weather, it was the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift that gripped the continent from the 14th to the 19th century, bringing winters so brutal they reshaped history. Average temperatures dropped by nearly 2 degrees Celsius, a small number with catastrophic consequences. Crops failed under early frosts, and snowdrifts swallowed entire villages. Daylight shrank to a mere 8 hours in some regions, leaving farmers racing against darkness to complete essential tasks. But the cold was only part of the nightmare. Prolonged winters meant livestock starved as pastures vanished beneath snow, and stored grain became a magnet for rodents and mold. Frozen ground made plowing impossible, delaying spring planting and tightening the grip of hunger. Even something as simple as fetching water became a perilous chore when wells iced over and buckets froze solid mid-haul. And then there was the wind howling through cracks in wattle and daub walls, extinguishing hearth fires that were the only source of warmth. Yet the most insidious threat was time. Medieval farmers didn't have the luxury of modern weather forecasts. A sudden thaw could flood fields, while an unseasonal frost might wipe out tender seedlings overnight. Survival depended on reading nature's subtle cues, the thickness of onion skins predicting harsh cold, or the behavior of birds hinting at early snow. Every decision, from when to slaughter livestock to how much grain to set aside, was a gamble with life or death stakes. This was the relentless reality medieval farmers faced. But within these extremes, they found opportunity. The very severity of winter forced innovations that would endure for centuries, turning scarcity into ingenuity. Their story isn't just about enduring the cold, it's about mastering it. When the first frost arrived, medieval farmers faced a race against time to preserve every scrap of meat before it spoiled. Without refrigeration, they turned to methods honed over generations. Salting and smoking weren't just techniques. They were lifelines. Take salting. Butchers would pack freshly slaughtered meat in layers of coarse salt, sometimes mixing in herbs like juniper or bay leaves to mask strong flavors. The salt drew out moisture, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. A well-salted haunch of pork or beef could last for months, even years, becoming the centerpiece of winter meals. In coastal regions, farmers used seawater to brine fish, while inland communities traded for salt at bustling fairs, valuing it as highly as currency. Smoking added another layer of protection. Meats were hung in chimney alcoves or special smokehouses, where smoldering hardwood, oak, applewood, or beech infused them with rich flavor while chemicals in the smoke acted as natural preservatives. The process could take weeks, with farmers carefully tending the fire to maintain just the right temperature. Too hot, and the meat would cook instead of cure. Too cool, and it might rot. The result: strips of smoky bacon, dried sausages, and ham that could weather the coldest months. But here's the clever part: these methods often worked in tandem. After salting, meat might be lightly smoked to seal in preservation, creating a double barrier against spoilage. And it wasn't just about survival, the flavors became cherished traditions. A bite of salt-cured mutton or smoked herring wasn't just nourishment. It was a taste of summer's abundance in the depths of winter's grip. The ingenuity didn't stop there. Farmers repurposed every part of the animal, rendering fat into tallow for candles, turning bones into broth, and even using bladders as storage sacks. Nothing went to waste because every scrap could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation. When we bite into a modern smoked sausage or sprinkle salt on our food today, we're tasting echoes of a system perfected by medieval farmers, one that turned simple ingredients into resilience. While salt and smoke preserved meat, vegetables and dairy posed a different challenge, one medieval farmers solved with bubbling vats, buried crocks, and the invisible magic of microbes. Pickling wasn't just about flavor, it was a survival strategy. In cellars and cool corners of cottages, cabbages transformed into sauerkraut through lactic acid fermentation, a process where naturally occurring bacteria broke down sugars, creating a tangy preserve rich in vitamin C. This wasn't merely a side dish, it was a shield against scurvy during months when fresh greens were impossible to grow. Farmers packed shredded cabbage tightly into wooden barrels, weighted it down with stones to exclude air, and let nature work. The result: a staple that could last through winter while boosting immunity, all without refrigeration. Dairy products demanded even more creativity. Without modern pasteurization, milk spoiled quickly unless it was transformed. Soft cheeses like quark were made by letting milk curdle naturally, then draining the whey through cloth. Hard cheeses, pressed and aged in cool caves, could last for years. But the real marvel was skyr, an Icelandic yogurt-like product medieval farmers created by incubating milk with leftover batches from previous seasons. This live culture not only preserved the milk, but packed it with probiotics long before science understood their benefits. Even failures became opportunities. When milk turned sour, it wasn't wasted, it became cottage cheese or baking buttermilk. Overripe fruit fermented into homemade vinegar, while turnips and beets submerged in brine morphed into pickles that added crunch and nutrition to sparse winter meals. These techniques did more than prevent starvation. They turned preservation into a form of alchemy, where ordinary ingredients became resilient, nutrient-dense foods. The brilliance lay in their understanding of balance. Too little salt in a pickle brine invited rot, while too much killed beneficial bacteria. Cheese wheels needed just the right humidity to age without molding. Through trial and error, farmers honed these methods into an edible science, passing down ratios and rituals that kept families fed. Today, when we bite into kimchi or sip kefir, we're tasting the legacy of medieval ingenuity where survival depended not just on storing food, but transforming it. Grain wasn't just a crop, it was currency, life insurance, and the foundation of survival through the long medieval winter. A single bad harvest could doom a village, while a well-stocked granary meant children wouldn't go to bed with hollow stomachs when the snows came. But storing grain wasn't as simple as piling it in a shed. Moisture meant mold, warmth invited insects, and rats could wipe out a year's labor in weeks. Farmers fought these threats with ingenious solutions that turned simple structures into fortresses of preservation. Take the granary raised high on stone straddle stones or wooden stilts like a house on chicken legs. This design wasn't whimsical. It created a ventilation gap that kept grain dry and made it harder for rodents to climb up. The buildings themselves were masterclasses in natural engineering, with walls woven from wattles plastered with a mix of clay, dung, and straw breathable enough to prevent condensation, but tight enough to block drafts. Some featured removable floorboards, allowing farmers to sweep out old husks and chaff that might harbor pests. But the real genius lay underground. In regions with stable soil, farmers dug bell-shaped storage pits, lining them with straw or burned clay to create an oxygen-deprived environment where grain could last for years. Archaeologists have found pits from the 9th century still containing viable seeds, testament to their effectiveness. The process was precise. Grain was packed tight, the pit sealed with clay or dung, and often marked with a stone to prevent accidental rediscovery during plowing. And then there was the unsung hero, chaff. This byproduct of threshing, often seen as waste, became a protective blanket. Layered between grain and storage vessels, it absorbed moisture and deterred insects with its sharp edges. Farmers even mixed in aromatic herbs like wormwood or tansy, early pesticides that kept weevils and moths at bay. Every choice reflected deep observation, knowing that damp grain fermented, that compacted grain generated heat, that a single rat could birth 200 descendants before spring. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A well-managed storehouse meant bread in February, seed for next year's planting, and perhaps even surplus to trade for salt or tools. But one mistake, a cracked seal on a pit, a gap in the granary walls, could unravel months of labor. This was food security written in straw and clay, a silent battle against entropy fought in cellars and attics across medieval Europe. When we see ancient grain silos today, we're not just looking at storage, we're seeing the blueprint of survival itself. Beneath the frozen earth, medieval farmers created nature's refrigerators, root cellars, and buried storage pits that kept vegetables crisp and sweet through winter's harshest months. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were precisely engineered microclimates where temperature and humidity conspired to slow decay. A well-built root cellar hovered just above freezing, with earthen walls maintaining a steady 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough to inhibit rot but warm enough to prevent freezing. The secret lay in the soil itself, which acted as insulation against surface temperature swings. Carrots buried in sand stayed moist but not soggy. Turnips packed in straw resisted mold, and onions hung in braids from the ceiling benefited from constant airflow that prevented softening. The science behind these methods was simple yet brilliant. Underground storage mimicked the conditions of a vegetable's natural dormancy period, tricking produce into thinking it was still in the earth awaiting spring. Clay pots, often sealed with beeswax or animal fat, created an even more controlled environment. Buried up to their necks in soil, these vessels maintained high humidity while allowing trace amounts of oxygen to circulate, key to preventing the buildup of ethylene gas that accelerates spoilage. In regions with sandy soil, farmers might layer vegetables between blankets of moss, which acted as a natural antibacterial barrier. From Irish klashans, beehive-shaped stone storage huts to Slavic, zemlyanka, pits lined with birch bark, these techniques spanned Europe. In Scandinavia, farmers packed root vegetables into wooden crates surrounded by fermented manure, whose gentle heat extended storage time. Alpine communities hollowed out natural caves, exploiting geothermal warmth to keep potatoes from freezing. Every solution reflected local conditions. Chalky soils in England lent themselves to cool, dry storage, while the waterlogged fields of the Netherlands encouraged above-ground ventilated crates. What's astonishing is how little energy these systems required. No electricity, no moving parts, just an intimate understanding of physics and biology. A turnip stored in a 13th century root cellar could stay fresh until Easter, while modern experiments show onions lasting 9 months in replicated conditions. These weren't just storage spaces, they were time machines, stretching summer's bounty deep into winter's grasp. Today's root cellar enthusiasts still swear by these ancient methods, proving that sometimes the oldest solutions are the most enduring. While root cellars preserved fresh vegetables, medieval farmers faced another challenge: how to store fragile fruits, flavor-packed herbs, and protein-rich legumes without them rotting or losing potency. Their solution: drying transformed delicate foods into unbreakable, lightweight lifelines that could last for years. Take fruits like apples, pears, and plums. Sliced thin and laid on woven reed mats or hung near the hearth, these would slowly wither into chewy, sweet concentrates of summer's abundance. Drying wasn't just about removing water. It concentrated the sugars, making fruits like raisins and dried figs precious sources of quick energy during the lean months. A handful could sweeten porridge or revive a traveler on icy roads, their compactness making them ideal for trade or long storage. Herbs underwent a similar metamorphosis. Thyme, sage, and rosemary were tied in bunches and suspended from kitchen rafters, where smoke and dry air preserved their essential oils. These weren't just seasonings, they were medicine. A tea of dried chamomile soothed winter coughs, while mint aided digestion after months of heavy salted meats. Farmers even dried nettles, which, when crumbled into soups, provided vital nutrients long after fresh greens vanished. The process was delicate. Too much heat destroyed flavors, while insufficient airflow invited mold. The best dried herbs retained their color and aroma, a testament to careful timing and skill. But the real superstars of drying were legumes, peas, beans, and lentils. These humble foods became the backbone of winter nutrition. Spread on flat roofs or woven screens, they baked in the late summer sun until hard as pebbles. Once dried, they could be stored in sacks or clay jars for years, immune to pests that attacked grain. When winter came, a handful tossed into a pot with salted meat and root vegetables swelled into hearty stews, releasing protein and fiber that kept families strong. Monastic records show dried peas as currency in some regions, traded measure for measure with grain. In Scandinavia, farmers even buried dried beans in grain stores. Their presence repelled weevils, doubling as pest control and emergency rations. The sheer efficiency of drying reveals medieval pragmatism. Unlike smoking or fermenting, it required no salt, no special tools, just patience and knowledge of air currents. A well-ventilated loft or sunny hillside became a factory of preservation. And when supplies ran low, these lightweight foods could be carried easily, unlike barrels of pickles or heavy grain sacks. That's why dried fruit appeared in pilgrim satchels, why herbalists' pouches held leathery leaves instead of fresh sprigs, and why armies marched on lentils and dried peas. In a world where winter stole freshness, drying gave farmers the power to stop time. Livestock weren't just animals to medieval farmers. They were four-legged savings accounts, each one a store of future meals, labor, and materials. When winter's grip tightened, every sheep, cow, and pig became a calculation of calories versus survival. The brutal arithmetic of the season forced difficult choices: which animals to keep alive through the cold months, and which to slaughter before the deep freeze made feeding them impossible. This wasn't random culling. It was a carefully orchestrated strategy that balanced immediate needs against future prosperity. The strongest, healthiest animals earned their place in winter's inner circle. A dairy cow that could produce milk through the cold months was worth her weight in grain, while a sturdy ox was kept alive to plow frozen fields come spring. Farmers favored resilient breeds: shaggy Highland cattle with their insulating coats, Sowy sheep that could scrape lichen from rocks when snow buried grasses, and Mangalitsa pigs whose thick fat layers doubled as both insulation and future lard. These animals were genetic investments, honed over generations to withstand the cruelest winters. Shelter wasn't just about comfort, it was survival architecture. Stone byres with low ceilings trapped animal body heat, while thatched roofs prevented condensation from dripping onto vulnerable livestock. In Scandinavia, farmers built fabads, dual-purpose barns where animals occupied the lower level while the family lived above, sharing warmth like a medieval heat exchange system. Some Welsh longhouses even had a central hearth that warmed both humans and animals in adjacent compartments, blurring the line between barn and home. But the real challenge was feeding them. Frozen pastures offered nothing, and every mouthful of stored hay or grain given to livestock was a mouthful not eaten by humans. Farmers stretched resources with ingenious tricks, mixing dried leaves into hay to bulk it out, soaking straw in brine to make it more palatable, or feeding pigs on acorns foraged during autumn and stored in woven baskets. In alpine regions, cows were given small amounts of spruce needles, a vitamin C boost that warded off scurvy when fresh greens vanished. The darkest nights brought the most surprising solutions. Some communities practiced leaf hang, collecting bundles of leafy branches in summer and hanging them in barn rafters. When winter came, animals would strip the dried leaves like nature's protein bars. Others fermented green fodder in pits, an early form of silage that preserved nutrients better than dry hay. And when all else failed, there was the last resort: blood soup. A small cut on a living cow's neck would provide nutrient-rich blood for a meal without killing the animal, a grim but effective protein source in famine winters. This delicate dance of husbandry reveals medieval farmers as master strategists. They didn't just react to winter, they anticipated it, breeding hardier animals, designing smarter shelters, and stretching every scrap of forage. The proof of their success: many of these winter-hardy breeds still exist today, living monuments to the ingenuity that turned survival into an art form. Hay wasn't just stacked, it was a carefully constructed fortress against famine, each layer a barrier against winter's hunger. Medieval farmers cut and dried grasses at the precise moment when nutrient content peaked, usually just before flowering, then stored them in towering thatched ricks shaped like giant beehives. These weren't haphazard piles. The steep slopes shed rainwater while allowing internal airflow, preventing the deadly mold that could poison livestock. In regions with heavy snowfall, farmers built haystacks on wooden platforms elevated 3 feet off the ground, creating a cold sink underneath that acted like nature's freezer, preserving freshness until spring thaw. While hay formed the backbone of winter feed, farmers supplemented with unlikely ingredients. Ash and elm leaves, gathered in autumn while still supple, were dried into crumbly bundles called leaf hay. Though coarse to human touch, these leafy packets contained surprising protein, up to 15% in ash leaves, making them critical emergency rations when blizzards buried traditional fodder. Records from 12th century England describe farmers beating branches with sticks to rain down dried leaves into waiting carts, a practice so vital some villages fined anyone caught stealing from communal leaf piles. Crop residues became the unsung heroes of winter feeding. Pea vines left after harvest, normally plowed under, were instead gathered and mixed with chopped straw to create fodder mash. Bean stalks, though tough, were boiled into digestible pulp, while flax fibers too short for linen production were softened with urine's ammonia to break down cellulose. Even grape pomace from winemaking, usually discarded, was pressed into dense cakes that burned slowly in animals' digestive systems like timed-release nutrients. Perhaps the most ingenious strategy was tree hay, actively cultivating certain trees as living pantries. Willow, poplar, and young oak saplings were pruned to encourage tender shoots at nibbling height. When snow covered the ground, farmers would chop these fresh branches daily, providing what we now recognize as essential phytonutrients absent in dried grasses. In Sweden, birch twigs became winter vitamin supplements, their buds packed with oils that boosted sheep's immune systems. Alpine herders went further, carving notches into bark so animals could lick the rising sap, a primitive form of sugar-based energy gel. Timing was everything. Stockpiling began not at harvest, but months earlier during Lammas hay, cuts in August when grasses regrew after summer grazing. This second growth, though less abundant, had higher protein content, perfect for late winter feeding when animals' energy reserves dwindled. Farmers also exploit vertical space. In the Italian Alps, hay was packed into cliffside caves where cool temperatures and airflow created natural preservation chambers untouched by ground moisture or pests. Every choice reflected deep ecological intuition. Farmers knew cattle could digest rougher fodder than delicate sheep. that pregnant ewes needed extra protein before lambing, and that goats, nature's original browsers, could thrive on woody shrubs that would starve other livestock. This wasn't just feeding animals, it was a high-stakes chemistry experiment balancing calories, nutrients, and sheer bulk to stretch finite resources across infinite winter nights. The proof of their success echoes today in traditional farming communities where these methods persist not as quaint traditions, but as proven survival technologies forged in the crucible of the medieval winter. Forests became winter's pantry for medieval farmers, offering hidden treasures that could mean the difference between scarcity and survival. While stored grains and preserved meats formed the backbone of winter diets, hunting and foraging added crucial variety, both in nutrients and flavor. A single deer brought down in November could provide nearly 200 pounds of meat, while a basket of foraged hazelnuts packed enough calories and protein to sustain a family for days. Wild game was more than just supplemental, it was strategic. Unlike livestock that consumed precious winter fodder, deer, boar, and rabbits fed themselves, converting inaccessible forest vegetation into protein. Hunters targeted older or injured animals first, preserving breeding stock, an early form of sustainable wildlife management. In snowy months, tracking became easier as prints stood out against white backgrounds, and hunger made animals bolder, venturing closer to human settlements. Butchers utilized every part. Hides became mittens or patched cloaks, bones were boiled into glue or carved into tools, and sinews transformed into thread for repairs when trading routes froze over. Foraging required an encyclopedic knowledge of the landscape. Families memorized the locations of perennial berry bushes, returning in winter to dig beneath snow for frozen lingonberries or rose hips nature's vitamin C capsules. Acorns, though bitter, were leached in streams to remove tannins before being ground into flour for dense, nutty bread. In mushroom-rich regions like the Carpathians, dried porcini added umami depth to broths when salt ran low. Even seemingly barren winter woods yielded surprises. Lichen could be soaked and cooked into gelatinous pulp, while birch bark scrapings held traces of sweet sap. The true brilliance lay in timing. Autumn's last warm weeks were a frenzy of activity, hunters setting snares for migratory birds, children gathering crabapples still clinging to bare branches, elders tapping pine trees for resin that doubled as both antiseptic and chewing gum. Every find was processed immediately. Berries were strung on threads and hung near hearths to dry, while mushrooms were skewered on sticks above smoke vents. Some communities practiced fire foraging, deliberately setting controlled burns in autumn to stimulate spring growth of fiddleheads and wild onions, ensuring next year's bounty. This wasn't random scavenging but a carefully choreographed dance with nature's rhythms. Farmers could read forests like calendars, knowing which south-facing slopes held the last edible greens or where ice-covered ponds made fish easier to spear. The knowledge was so precise that some Scandinavian families still follow ancestral hunger roads, secret paths to hidden berry patches mapped generations ago. In a world where winter erased boundaries between village and wilderness, survival belonged to those who could read the land's quiet whispers. Winter isolation wasn't just endured alone, it was weathered together through webs of obligation and generosity that bound medieval villages into single living organisms. When the snow piled higher than cottage doors, survival depended on unwritten contracts of mutual aid passed down through generations. Take the village grain bank, a communal insurance system where every family contributed a portion of their harvest to a shared storehouse. This wasn't charity, it was calculated interdependence. A widow with struggling fields one year might draw loans of barley to plant come spring, repaying the village when her fortunes turned. In alpine communities, these grain stores were locked with two keys, one held by the priest, another by the miller, ensuring no single person could exploit the collective safety net. Barn raisings transformed individual hardship into collective triumph. When a family's storage barn burned or collapsed under snow loads, neighbors appeared within hours with axes and rope. By sundown, a new structure would rise as men notched logs together and women prepared cauldrons of stew from pooled ingredients. These weren't just practical events, they were social contracts in action, where the labor given today guaranteed help received tomorrow. Records from 14th century Switzerland show farmers traveling up to 10 miles to assist neighboring villages, knowing their own crises might require distant aid. The sharing extended to specialized tools. Most families couldn't afford alone a communal cider press hauled between orchards, a shared plow pulled by village oxen, even collectively owned beehives tended by designated keepers. In times of extreme scarcity, some communities practiced hunger sharing, where each household contributed one pot to a daily communal soup, stretching scarce ingredients further than any family could manage alone. Scandinavian Fabad systems saw multiple families jointly manage remote summer pastures, taking turns guarding livestock so others could focus on harvests. Perhaps the most poignant tradition was the gleaning hour. After formal harvests ended, village elders would open fields to the poor, allowing them to collect every overlooked stalk or tuber. This wasn't seen as theft but as sacred redistribution, an acknowledgement that survival was collective or not at all. Church bells in parts of France still ring at traditional gleaning times, echoing medieval rhythms of shared abundance. These systems thrived on reciprocity rather than record-keeping. A Dutch farmer might receive help digging out a snowbound cow in January, then return the favor by lending his prized butter molds come spring. Welsh Seifar laws codified this balance, requiring 3 days of shared labor from each household during critical seasons. The genius lay in flexibility assistance scaled to need, with the understanding that all would contribute according to their means. When modern historians analyzed village records from medieval Essex, they found less than 2% of households required permanent, poor relief evidence of a system that caught people before they fell. This interdependence created resilience no individual could achieve. A bad harvest for one family became manageable when distributed across 20 households. A frozen river blocking trade routes meant little when villages were self-sufficient ecosystems. The medieval winter didn't just test personal endurance, it revealed how deeply human survival is woven from threads of cooperation. In an age before social services or disaster relief, these intricate networks of obligation became the real safety net, proving that community wasn't just support, it was survival incarnate. Wool was the medieval farmer's first line of defense against winter's bite, a material so versatile it functioned like nature's technical fabric. Unlike modern garments designed for style, every stitch in a farmer's tunic served a thermodynamic purpose. The secret lay in lanolin, the natural oil-coating sheep's wool that repelled water while trapping insulating air pockets. Farmers wore tunics woven in a loose, fulled weave that felted slightly with wear, creating windproof layers without sacrificing breathability. But the real genius was in the layers, a linen undershirt to wick moisture, a thick woolen kirtle as the insulating middle, and an outer cloak of coarse, frieze wool with long fibers that shed snow like a thatched roof. In particularly brutal regions, some even stitched dried moss between fabric layers as primitive insulation, creating a garment that was essentially a wearable root cellar. Footwear revealed equally clever adaptations. Leather boots were stuffed with straw or wrapped in strips of wool to create dead airspace, while those who couldn't afford leather wound footcloths, long strips of woolen fabric, around their feet in intricate patterns that prevented blisters while providing warmth equivalent to modern thermal socks. Icelandic farmers took this further by crafting shoes from dried sheepskins with the wool facing inward, essentially turning their feet into tiny heated caves. Gloves were often fingerless to maintain dexterity during chores, with separate mittens tied to sleeves for moments when outright warmth trumped precision. Animal pelts became mobile heating systems. Squirrel fur lined cloaks in Russia not for luxury, but because its dense underfur trapped heat more efficiently than thicker furs. In Scandinavia, reindeer hides with hollow hair shafts provided insulation so effective that modern scientists still study their microstructure for thermal applications. Poorer families made do with layered rabbit pelts stitched together, the multiple thin layers creating better insulation than a single thick hide. Even children's clothing reflected pragmatism. Toddlers wore pudding caps, padded woolen helmets tied under the chin, because heat lost through the scalp could be deadly during long winter chores. Yet these ingenious solutions had heartbreaking limits. Damp wool lost up to 80% of its insulating properties, and few farmers own enough changes of clothing to always stay dry. Frostbite was so common some village records listed men by nicknames like Three-Toed Thomas, the porous layered rags secured with belts of twisted straw, while in especially harsh winters, some resorted to stuffing their clothes with dried leaves or even goose feathers plucked from live birds to create makeshift down jackets. Textile shortages forced impossible choices. Should precious wool be used to patch a child's cloak or reinforce the cow's blanket to keep the milk supply flowing? The contrast between rich and poor could be measured in layers. While nobility wore silk-lined fur mantles, many farmers slept in their day clothes, removing only their rope belts to avoid chilling their cores during sleep. Women's skirts often doubled as blankets at night, with some German peasant families sharing a single heavy bed gown passed between members taking turns to fetch firewood in pre-dawn darkness. Yet even these limitations sparked creativity. Some Welsh shepherds developed a spinning technique using frozen wool fibers that produced an exceptionally dense yarn, while Baltic farmers wove horsetail hairs into fabric for added wind resistance. These clothing strategies reveal more than just survival tactics. They show how every scrap of material became part of an ecological equation. A single sheep's fleece might become socks, a cloak lining, and finally, when too worn for wear, insulation stuffed into wall cracks. Nothing was just clothing. Each garment was a lifeline woven from necessity, ingenuity, and an intimate understanding of how to cheat the cold for one more day. The hearth wasn't just a source of heat, it was the pulsating heart of the medieval home, a living thing that demanded constant attention. Unlike modern central heating, which whispers warmth through hidden vents, a medieval fireplace roared its presence, crackling and spitting as it devoured fuel at an alarming rate. The simplest homes relied on open hearths, flat stones arranged in the center of dirt floors, with smoke curling up to blacken roof thatch before escaping through a crude hole. These fire pits radiated heat in all directions, but their inefficiency was staggering. Up to 90% of the warmth vanished straight up with the smoke, while drafts creeping through unsealed walls stole the rest. Enter the revolutionary invention of the hooded fireplace, emerging in wealthier homes by the 12th century. This architectural leap channeled smoke up a chimney instead of letting it suffocate the room, while a projecting hood reflected heat back into living spaces. But even these improvements had limits. The average fireplace gulped down a cartload of firewood every week during deep winter, forcing families to ration warmth like gold. In regions where timber was scarce, the choice between cooking and heating became a daily dilemma. Farmers burned anything combustible: dried cow dung packed into bricks, peat cut from bogs, even tightly twisted straw that flared hot but fast. The real battle wasn't just making heat, it was trapping it. Without insulation, stone walls wept condensation, and drafts snuck through gaps between ill-fitting door frames. Families fought back with layered defenses. Woven tapestries hung over doorways, rushes piled ankle-deep on floors, and beds shoved closest to the hearth, where entire households might huddle together under shared blankets for collective warmth. In the Alps, farmers embedded hot stones from the fire into straw-filled mattresses, creating primitive heated beds, while Baltic families piled snow against exterior walls as makeshift insulation. Counterintuitively, the compacted snow acted as a buffer against wind. Perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was the smoke room, found in areas like the Scottish Highlands. Here, homes deliberately eliminated chimneys, allowing smoke to linger at ceiling level before seeping out through thatch. The result: meat hung from rafters cured in the smoky air, while the family below benefited from trapped heat that would otherwise escape. Every cough from the smoke was a trade-off for a few extra degrees of warmth. Wealthier households experimented with early central heating, the hypocaust systems inspired by Roman baths, where underground channels funneled heat from a single fire through hollow spaces under floors. More common were stube rooms in German regions, small, tightly sealed chambers with benches built around wall-mounted heaters, the ancestors of modern saunas. But for most, warmth came down to strategy, baking bread in the evening to leave residual oven heat, timing chores to coincide with the sun's brief appearance, and the unspoken rule that whoever fed the fire earned the closest seat to its glow. The fireplace's dominance shaped daily rhythms. Children learned to judge temperatures by how frost crystallized on interior walls. Elderly family members were given the fire seat, both an honor and a necessity for those whose bodies struggled to retain heat. Even the placement of livestock mattered in some longhouses. Body heat from animals in adjacent stalls bled through wattle walls, taking the edge off winter nights. This wasn't just heating, it was a high-stakes game of thermal chess, where every move from the angle of a chimney flew to the timing of a log's placement, could checkmate the cold or surrender to it. When firewood ran low, medieval farmers turned to the earth itself for fuel, digging up dense, carbon-rich peat from bogs or shaping animal dung into crackling bricks. These weren't just desperate substitutes, they were carefully engineered solutions to a life or death equation. Peat, the partially decayed plant matter accumulated over centuries in waterlogged wetlands, burned slower and hotter than wood when properly dried. Villagers would cut peat blocks in summer using special spades with long, narrow blades, stacking the bricks in honeycomb patterns to air dry for months. The best peat came from depth older, more compacted layers that burned with minimal smoke, a precious commodity in homes where respiratory ailments already flourished. In Ireland, families guarded their peat bog allocations as fiercely as farmland, passing cutting rights through generations like heirlooms. Dung offered another ingenious fuel source, especially in treeless regions like the Scottish Highlands or Mongolian steppes. Cattle manure mixed with straw was kneaded into flat cakes and pressed against sunny stone walls to dry, transforming waste into slow-burning energy packets. The straw acted as a binder while also creating tiny air channels that improved combustion, medieval science at its most practical. Nomadic cultures took this further, mixing dung with salt or crushed shells to alter burn rates, creating customized fuels for cooking versus heating. Efficiency dictated every step. Peat ash was sifted for potash to make lye for soap, while dung fire residue became fertilizer for spring planting, closing the resource loop. The smells were unavoidable. Peat fires carried an earthy, smoky aroma, while dung burned with a distinct tang, but survival trumped comfort. In extreme cold, some farmers even layered fresh dung around the outside of homes as insulation, its gradual decomposition releasing trace heat. These fuels shaped daily rhythms. Peat required constant attention, too much airflow reduced it to ash too quickly, while smoldering piles demanded vigilant stirring. Dung bricks burned hottest when arranged in specific patterns, knowledge passed down through rhymes and riddles to ensure proper airflow. The poorest families supplemented with whatever would burn: dried reeds, pine cones, even animal bones, each choice a calculation between warmth, duration, and the acridness of smoke. What seems primitive today was, in its time, sophisticated energy management. Modern experiments show well-prepared peat reaching temperatures over 900 degrees Fahrenheit, while dung mixes from certain grass-fed animals burned cleaner than expected. These weren't just fuels, they were the culmination of centuries of observation how moisture content affected burn time, which animal diets produced the least smoke, how stacking angles influenced heat radiation. When we flip a modern thermostat, we're spared this intricate dance of survival, but somewhere beneath our feet, those ancient peat bogs still hold the imprint of hands that turned mud and manure into warmth. Winter's grip didn't just force medieval farmers indoors, it transformed their homes into bustling workshops where idle hands became engines of preparation. With fields frozen solid and daylight scarce, these months became a critical season for repairing, crafting, and bartering. A cracked plowshare left unmended could spell disaster come spring, So farmers honed blades by firelight, their whetstones singing against metal in rhythmic strokes. Wooden handles splintered from autumn harvests were carved anew from seasoned oak, their curves shaped to fit calloused palms. Even the simplest tools received meticulous attention, scythes sharpened to lethal edges, rakes reinforced with fresh willow bindings, and leather harnesses stitched back together with sinew thread. Every repair was an investment in next year's survival. But winter work stretched far beyond tool maintenance. Long nights were filled with the rhythmic clatter of loom weights as women spun wool into yarn, transforming summer's shearing into next year's clothing. Baskets took shape under skilled fingers, woven from pliable willow soaked in thawing streams to prevent cracking. These weren't just containers, they were vital for spring planting, sheep shearing, and market trips. In regions like the Pyrenees, farmers crafted snowshoes from bent birch and rawhide, knowing deep drifts would linger into planting season. Alpine communities carved intricate butter molds, their geometric designs turning everyday dairy into tradable art. The real magic happened when these goods entered the barter economy. A well-made yoke might trade for 2 sacks of grain. A finely woven fishing net could fetch enough salt to preserve next winter's meat. Villagers gathered at frost fairs where turnips became currency, and blacksmiths negotiated repairs and promises of future labor. Some transactions were dazzlingly complex. Norwegian records describe farmers trading a year's worth of tool sharpening for the right to graze sheep on a neighbor's summer pasture. Even children's labor had value. In Slavic villages, teens could earn their winter boots by spending evenings knitting socks for the elderly. This quiet industry turned scarcity into opportunity. A Suffolk farmer might spend January crafting wooden spoons not because his family needed them, but because they were lightweight and valuable, easy to transport when spring thaw reopened roads to distant markets. In Sweden, surplus birch tar from waterproofing boots became a coveted export, traded as far as the Hanseatic League. The humblest materials found new life. Frayed rope became caulking for boats, cracked pottery shards morphed into game tokens, and even goose quills were saved to trade with wandering scribes. Every item represented a calculation not just of labor and materials, but of future need. The system thrived on interdependence. A cobbler might accept payment in kind, not coins, but promises of summer berries or autumn firewood. In the Loire Valley, wheelwrights kept detailed tally sticks notching debts that could span years, their trust as durable as the oak they worked. When spring finally came, these winter-made goods flowed along thawing trade routes, binding isolated communities into a web of mutual survival. What looked like simple crafting was, in truth, the medieval equivalent of stockpiling currency, except the real wealth wasn't in objects, but in the relationships forged over glowing hearths and half-finished baskets. Hidden beneath this economy was an unspoken calendar. Certain crafts aligned with celestial events, cheese presses carved during the December solstice were believed to last longer, while tools forged on Candlemas were thought to carry special durability. Superstition and pragmatism intertwined. A Scottish crofter might weave his first basket of the year clockwise for luck, then switch directions once the pattern was established. These rituals underscored the gravity of winter work. It wasn't just busy work, but a sacred bridge between one year's harvest and the next. When modern archaeologists uncover perfectly preserved medieval tools, they're not just seeing objects, they're witnessing the silent industry that turned winter's constraints into next season's hope. When the world outside frosted over, the flickering light of rush lamps illuminated one of winter's most vital tasks, turning raw wool into warmth. Spinning wasn't just women's work. It was the foundation of a family's comfort and economic survival. On long December nights, even children as young as 5 mastered the drop spindle, its weighted whorl spinning wool fibers into thread with hypnotic rhythm. The real skill came in judging the twist too tight, and the yarn would kink, too loose, and it would fray under the loom's tension. Experienced spinners could produce thread fine enough for delicate veils or thick enough for hard-wearing work socks, their fingers reading the wool's texture like a language. In wealthier households, the distaff became a winter companion, a vertical staff clamped under the arm with wool bundles tied at the top, allowing spinners to walk while working, their hands never idle. Weaving transformed these threads into tangible wealth. The loom's wooden frame dominated cottages during winter months, its rhythmic clatter marking time like a metronome. Warp threads stretched taut as a winter sky, while the weaver's shuttle loaded with hand-spun yarn darted back and forth like a persistent bird building its nest. Patterns weren't just decorative, they were coded messages. In Scandinavian regions, specific stripe sequences identified a family's village at market, while Celtic weavers incorporated symbolic knots believed to ward off misfortune. The tightest weaves created weathercloth, a fabric so densely packed it could shed rain like a thatched roof, invaluable for shepherds and fishermen. Sewing circles became winter's social networks. Neighbors gathered to share candlelight, their needles flashing as they stitched layers of linen and wool into double cloth, a sandwich of fabrics with an insulating air pocket in between. These weren't just quilting bees, they were production lines where a single well-made cloak could trade for a month's worth of salt. Men participated too, particularly in crafting leather goods, repairing worn-out shoes with fresh soles cut from oak-tanned hides, or stitching sheepskin into mittens with the fleece still attached for natural insulation. The economic impact rippled far beyond the home. In Yorkshire, entire villages specialized in hosen, tight-fitting woolen leggings that became coveted trade items across Europe. Flemish weavers produced such fine woolens that their cloth was measured in ells and used as currency in some markets. Even the humblest homes contributed to this textile economy. Records from medieval Frankfurt show peddlers accepting patched-together rag bundles for recycling into paper. Nothing was too insignificant to have value. Tools themselves became heirlooms. A well-carved sewing needle case might pass through 3 generations, its bone surface polished smooth by decades of use. Spinning wheels represented major investments. Some Swiss wills list them alongside livestock in value. The wooden niddy-noddy, used to wind yarn into skeins, often bore carved initials or protective symbols, blending practicality with superstition. What's remarkable is how these crafts turned winter's constraints into advantages. Cold air held fewer dust particles, making it ideal for spinning without fiber contamination. The low humidity prevented flax from becoming brittle during processing. Even the dim light played a role. Working with darker wools in winter reduced eye strain compared to summer's glaring sun. Every step in the textile chain, from sorting raw fleece to the final stitch, was timed in nature's rhythms. By spring, when fields demanded attention, chests would be full of finished cloth ready to wear, trade, or barter. The true measure of a successful winter wasn't just surviving the cold. It was hearing the loom fall silent because every thread had been transformed into security. Amidst the unrelenting cold, medieval winters held unexpected oases of light and laughter, festivals where hardship momentarily yielded to revelry. Christmas wasn't just a religious observance, it was a psychological lifeline, a 12-day pause in the battle against winter's brutality. Villagers who had survived on salted fish and thin gruel since autumn suddenly gathered around tables groaning with spiced meats, honeyed cakes, and the rarest luxury of all, fresh bread, baked from grain normally reserved for seed. The Yule log, carefully selected from the hardest oak, burned non-stop throughout the festivities, its enduring flame a defiant symbol against the darkness outside. Twelfth Night crowned this season with raucous role reversals that turned social hierarchies upside down. A plowboy might be crowned Lord of Misrule, issuing whimsical decrees, while the village priest endured good-natured teasing in skits performed by firelight. These weren't just games, they were pressure valves for societies strained by scarcity. In England, mummers in grotesque masks paraded from house to house, their body plays mocking the very hardships everyone faced, a form of communal therapy long before the term existed. The feasts themselves were triumphs of ingenuity. Dishes like fermenty, wheat boiled in milk with dried fruit, transformed meager stores into celebratory fare. A single precious hen, saved from autumn culling, might appear at the center of a pottage enriched with last summer's preserved berries. In Scandinavia, fermented fish took on new life as lutefisk, its jelly-like texture considered a delicacy when served with mustard sauce. Alcohol flowed freely, not just for merriment but for warmth. Spiced, wassail bowls passed hand to hand, their steam carrying the aroma of cinnamon and cloves. Music and dance became survival tools as much as entertainment. French peasants performed the brand, a vigorous chain dance designed to circulate blood in freezing halls, while German villages held straw dances where participants stamped rhythmically on scattered straw to simulate SUMMERS Chinese letter IELD work. Carols weren't merely sung, they were communal spells against despair, their lyrics promising the inevitable return of spring even as snowdrifts mounted outside. These festivals wove together practicality and mysticism. The lighting of candles on Candlemas, February 2nd, wasn't just symbolic, it marked the point where daylight noticeably returned, a tangible sign that winter's back was breaking. In Scotland, the Up Helliah Fire Festival saw torches hurled into a replica Viking ship, a spectacle that channeled collective frustration into controlled catharsis. Even children's games held deeper meaning. The Hoodman blind version of blindfolded tag played in icy courtyards was thought to confuse malevolent winter spirits. For all their joy, these celebrations were tightly rationed. The same communities that feasted in January might be down to their last grain reserves by March. But that restraint made the holidays more precious, a fleeting reminder that winter was neither eternal nor unconquerable. When modern historians analyze village records, they find curious patterns. Fewer deaths occurred in the weeks following major festivals, as if the collective boost in morale strengthened bodies against the cold. The true miracle of medieval winter wasn't just surviving, it was finding reasons to celebrate amidst the struggle. Faith wasn't just a comfort in medieval winters, it was a lifeline woven into every frozen sunrise and howling blizzard. When the first snows fell, villagers recited the winter psalms, special verses begging deliverance from starvation and wolves. Churches became thermal refuges, their stone walls absorbing warmth from packed congregations during marathon, cold masses, where breath hung in frosty clouds above bowed heads. The lighting of Advent candles marked more than religious observance, each flame represented another week closer to solstice's turning point, a celestial promise that darkness wouldn't prevail. Saints took on urgent seasonal roles. December's Saint Barbara became the patron of explosive winter thunderstorms, her iconography showing lightning bolts frozen mid-strike. Families hung St. Calman's bells, tiny tin replicas above doorways to mute winter's howling winds, while travelers pinned St. Christopher medals to cloaks as shields against sudden snow squalls. In alpine regions, farmers carried carved St. Leonard figurines to barns, believing the patron saint of livestock could prevent mysterious winter cattle plagues. These weren't abstract devotions, they were daily survival tools as practical as wool mittens or salted meat. The liturgical calendar structured time itself. Candlemas on February 2nd wasn't just a feast day. It marked when villagers could finally burn their last precious beeswax candles without guilt, knowing daylight was returning. Plough Monday, the first workday after Epiphany, saw priests blessing plowshades with holy water before farmers stored them for spring, a ritual blending agriculture and theology. Even the raucous Feast of Fools in January served a psychological purpose by mocking authority during the year's bleakest month. Peasants released pent-up tensions that might otherwise boil over into violence. Superstitions bridged faith and folklore. Certain cloud formations on St. Hildegard's Day supposedly predicted late frosts, while the way snow collected on thatched roofs was read like divine handwriting. Finding 2 yolks in a winter egg might signal impending hardship, prompting families to tighten their rationing. In Norway, farmers listened for echoes against frozen lakes. Clear reverberations meant more cold, muffled sounds hinted at thaw. These beliefs weren't naive. They were attempts to decode patterns in nature's chaos, creating illusions of control when survival felt precarious. Winter saints developed specialized miracles. Irish families left oatcakes for St. Bridget on her February feast day. trusting she'd multiply their grain stores. In Poland, straw from St. Lucia Day wreaths was fed to hens to encourage winter egg production. Russian peasants buried St. Nicolaus icons at field boundaries, believing he'd keep spring floods from washing away topsoil. The line between prayer and practical magic blurred completely in practices like the weather cross, 2 sticks bound in wool and hidden under eaves to divert sleet storms. The darkest nights birthed profound rituals. On Christmas Eve, Bohemian farmers carried torches around orchards to warm the trees against frost, while Welsh shepherds baked spirit cakes left on fences to appease restless winter ghosts. In Scandinavia, the Yule goat made of last year's harvest straw was ceremonially burned to ensure its fertility returned to the soil. Even church authorities tolerated these folk traditions, recognizing their power to sustain hope through the hungry gap between winter and spring. What modern eyes might dismiss as superstition was, in its time, sophisticated spiritual resilience. When a Saxon mother whispered charms over her coughing child or a Burgundian winemaker pruned vines by the Fays-approved almanac, they weren't rejecting faith, they were expanding it into every crack winter forced into their lives. The true miracle wasn't any single ritual's efficacy, but how belief systems adapted to feed both souls and bodies when the earth itself seemed barren. In an age before weather forecasts or emergency heating, these practices formed a psychological armor against despair, proof that sometimes the most vital survival tool is the conviction that spring will come. Snow wasn't just an obstacle to medieval farmers, it was a winter ally, repurposed with ingenuity that would put modern survivalists to shame. In regions where drifts piled higher than doorways, farmers packed snow against their cottage walls like nature's insulation, creating a frozen barrier that blocked wind more effectively than straw or mud alone. Icelandic sagas describe entire homes buried intentionally under snowbanks, the thick white blanket stabilizing interior temperatures far better than thatch or timber could. The same principle applied to root cellars. Snow layered over storage pits kept turnips and cabbages just above freezing, while buried barrels of apples stayed crisp until spring. But the real innovation came in water management. Villages near the Alps cut ice blocks from frozen streams and stacked them in shaded pits lined with straw, creating primitive reservoirs that slowly melted into drinking water as winter waned. Some Scottish clans went further, carving gutters into snowbanks to channel meltwater directly into covered cisterns, ensuring clean hydration when wells remained locked in ice. Even livestock benefited. Herders in the Carpathians led sheep to lick carefully packed snow mounds laced with salt, a clever workaround when streams froze solid for months. Snow's cooling power became medieval refrigeration. Finnish hunters buried game birds in snow-filled hollow trees to prevent spoilage, while Baltic fishermen packed their catch between layers of snow in woven baskets, keeping it fresh for market days. The technique was so effective that 12th century London fishmongers paid premium prices for snow-chilled herring arriving from Scandinavia. Dairy farmers exploited this too. Butter wrapped in snow-lined birchbark containers lasted weeks longer than cellar-stored versions, a trick still used by Sami reindeer herders today. Perhaps most astonishing were the snow kilns of the Pyrenees. Pottery makers piled snow over unfired clay vessels, then lit slow-burning fires beneath. As the snow melted gradually, it created a humid environment that prevented cracking during drying, an early form of climate-controlled ceramics. Similarly, glassmakers in Bohemia used packed snowbanks to cool their delicate creations slowly, reducing shattering from thermal shock. Every flake held potential if you knew how to harness it. The brilliance lay in seeing snow not as an enemy, but as a versatile material. Children's snow tunnels became cold storage for root vegetables, while snowshoed paths marked safe routes over frozen bogs. In Norway, farmers even timed their woodcutting to coincide with heavy snows. The white blanket cushioned falling trees, preventing damage to precious timber. When modern skiers glide over powder or kids build snow forts, they're unknowingly touching the edges of an ancient survival science that transformed winter's burden into a toolkit for resilience. beneath the ice-locked surfaces of medieval lakes and rivers. An entire hidden economy thrived, one where fishing lines replaced plows and holes in the ice became lifelines to fresh protein. For communities near water, winter didn't mean the end of fishing. It demanded reinvention. The moment ice grew thick enough to bear weight, villagers armed with augers and chisels ventured onto the frozen expanse, carving precise holes just wide enough to lower nets or lines. This wasn't casual hobby fishing. It was high-stakes survival, where a single day's catch could mean the difference between nourishing stews and grinding hunger. Techniques varied by region but shared ruthless efficiency. In Scandinavia, fishermen wove funnel-shaped nets from willow reeds, submerging them vertically through ice holes to trap schooling fish like perch or pike. The net's design exploited fish behavior. Curious species nosing into the wide entrance found themselves trapped in the narrowing tail. Further east, Baltic communities used hook lines, baited with preserved insects or scraps of salted meat, dangling dozens of hooks at varying depths to maximize chances. The real innovation lay in the silent waiting. Small bells tied to lines would chime when a fish bit, alerting fishermen dozing in nearby shelters. Shelter itself became an art form. Some built fish houses, portable wooden huts dragged onto the ice with felt-lined walls to retain body heat. These tiny cabins often doubled as trading posts, where fresh catch could be bartered for grain or wool on the spot. In Russia's Lake Ladoga, entire temporary villages sprouted on the ice, with smoke from fish drying fires curling over the frozen landscape. The most skilled ice fishermen read the ice like pages in a book. Clear blue ice signaled strength, while milky patches warned of weak spots. Certain areas near natural springs or river mouths stayed ice-free, becoming prized fishing grounds even in deep winter. The catch wasn't just food, it was a dietary revolution when most meals relied on salted or dried provisions. Fresh fish provided vital vitamins and fats missing from winter rations, with oily species like herring offering precious omega-3 that boosted immunity. Some communities practiced live storage, keeping fish alive in submerged baskets or icy pits near shore, effectively creating natural refrigerators. In Bohemia, carp harvested through ice holes were fattened in household tubs until needed, a trick still used in Czech Christmas markets today. But ice fishing's true genius lay in its secondary uses. The same holes provided fresh water when wells froze solid. Chopped ice blocks became cooling agents for root cellars. Even the fish waste had value. Scales saved for crafting slick armor lining. Bones boiled into glue for tool repairs. When modern scientists analyzed ice cores near medieval fishing sites, they found layers rich in fish proteins and plant fibers from nets, proving how intensively these frozen waters were worked. The dangers were ever present. Thin ice could swallow a man in seconds, while blizzards erased landmarks, leaving fishermen disoriented on featureless white plains. Yet the rewards justified the risk. Icelandic sagas tell of families surviving famine winters on nothing but char caught through ice, while Swiss monastery records show ice fish trout paying tithes when grain stores ran low. This wasn't just subsistence, it was adaptation at its sharpest, turning a frozen barrier into a larder. Today's ice anglers, drilling holes with power augers and electronic fish finders, are heirs to a tradition where patience and ingenuity pierced winter's grip one catch at a time. Winter didn't just bring cold to medieval farmers, it brought invisible enemies in the form of diseases that thrived in cramped, smoky cottages and biting winds. Frostbite was the most visible assailant, turning fingers and toes white before blackening into gangrene. Without modern medicine, peasants relied on gruesome but practical solutions. Snow was packed around frostbitten limbs to slow tissue damage, while warmed sheep's urine rich in ammonia was applied to prevent infection. In extreme cases, village barbers performed crude amputations with saws sanitized in boiling vinegar, sealing wounds with honey or spider webs as primitive antiseptics. But prevention was always preferable. Families smeared goose grease on exposed skin before venturing outside, creating a barrier against windburn, while felted wool inserts in boots wick moisture away from vulnerable toes. Respiratory infections were silent killers, thriving in poorly ventilated homes where hearth smoke hung heavy. Cough of the long nights, as some chronicles called it, could escalate from a tickle to pneumonia within days. Herbal remedies became frontline defenses. Thyme steeped in hot water loosened phlegm, while horehound candy, a bitter concoction of honey and crushed leaves, suppressed hacking fits. Some healers hung bunches of lavender from rafters, believing its scent purified the air, while others prescribed onion poultices strapped to the chest to draw out congestion. In Wales, families burned juniper branches, filling homes with aromatic smoke thought to ward off lung ailments. Gut-wrenching stomach illnesses flourished when winter diets narrowed to salted meats and stale grains. Winter flux struck suddenly, leaving victims dehydrated from relentless diarrhea. Dried bilberries boiled into tea became a trusted remedy, their tannins soothing inflamed intestines. Fennel seeds chewed after meals aided digestion, while fermented birch sap provided probiotics long before the term existed. Monasteries brewed stomach ales, infused with wormwood or gentian root potent bitters that stimulated appetite and bile production. Perhaps the most feared winter affliction was the black melancholy, a catch-all term for the crushing depression that set in during endless dark months. Villagers combated it with surprising sophistication. St. John's wort, gathered at summer's peak and preserved in oil, was rubbed on wrists to lighten the spirits. Communal storytelling sessions around the hearth kept minds active, while repetitive tasks like spinning or wood carving provided meditative relief. Some Nordic communities staged mock sunrises, lifting torches high at dawn to simulate the missing light's return. The true test of these remedies wasn't just efficacy, it was accessibility. A serf couldn't afford imported spices, so local plants dominated. Dock leaves relieved nettle stings, dandelion roots detoxified sluggish livers, and pine needle tea staved off scurvy. Every cure reflected a brutal pragmatism. When a Saxon child developed rickets from lack of sunlight, animal bones were charred into powder and mixed with cider, a crude calcium supplement. What these methods lacked in scientific precision, they made up for in accumulated observation. Generations of trial and error had identified which molds on bread could heal wounds, penicillin precursors, and which would kill you. Healing wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Amulets carved from rowan wood hung over cradles to break fevers, while whispered charms accompanied the application of poultices. In the Scottish Highlands, ailing patients were passed through holes in standing stones, believing the rock would absorb their illness. These practices weren't mere superstition, they activated the placebo effect, giving hope where medicine faltered. When every winter could be your last, belief was as vital as broth. The legacy of these remedies lingers. Modern studies confirm thyme's antibacterial properties, validate St. John's wort's antidepressant effects, and recognize honey's wound-healing enzymes. What medieval farmers intuited through necessity, science now explains. Their greatest triumph wasn't any single cure, but the resilience to keep experimenting, turning frozen meadows into pharmacies and hearth smoke into healing steam. The shadow of famine loomed over every medieval winter, a specter as relentless as the frozen winds. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 wasn't an anomaly, it was the nightmare scenario every village prepared against. Triggered by years of relentless rain that rotted crops in the fields, followed by savage winters that killed surviving livestock, the crisis left entire regions eating bark, roots, and even clay to fill their bellies. Chroniclers wrote of parents abandoning children they could no longer feed, and of desperate crowds gathering outside monastery gates, their hands outstretched for moldy crusts. Yet within this horror lay a grim lesson. Medieval farmers didn't just react to famine, they engineered systems to outsmart it. Stockpiling was their first defense, but the truly savvy diversified like modern investors. Villagers planted famine crops, hardy plants like turnips, parsnips, and kale that could weather frosts and provide emergency nutrition. In Ireland, farmers intercropped oats with bitter vetch, a legume that could be detoxified through careful preparation if grain stores failed. Scandinavian households buried bread stones, flat rocks engraved with crosses under their fields, believing they'd ensure future harvests while stockpiling dried fish as a protein backstop. Across Europe, acorns were gathered not just for pigs but as potential human sustenance. Leached of their tannins, they could be ground into a coarse, nutty flour when wheat and rye ran out. The real ingenuity lay in food-stretching techniques that turned scarcity into survival. In lean years, grain was bulked out with sawdust, powdered tree bark, or even crushed animal bones to extend loaves. Famine bread, recipes from German monasteries reveal mixtures of ground peas, dried nettles, and whatever scant flour remained. Fermentation became a lifeline. Watery, small beer, brewed from leftover grains provided calories without intoxication, while fermented birch sap offered nutrients when fresh greens were unobtainable. Some French villages practiced blood porridge, adding small amounts of livestock blood to grain mush for iron and protein without slaughtering valuable animals. Community networks acted as shock absorbers. Icelandic sagas describe hunger shares, where wealthier families supported poorer neighbors through winter with the expectation of reciprocal aid in future crises. In England, manorial courts enforced gleaning rights, ensuring the destitute could scavenge leftover grain from harvested fields. The most forward-thinking villages maintained famine gardens, communal plots of perennial herbs and resilient vegetables that could be harvested in emergencies. These weren't acts of charity but calculated survival strategies. A starving neighbor might steal your food, but a fed neighbor could help defend your stores. Historical records reveal chilling adaptations during the worst famines. 13th century Scottish farmers developed thatching frost, layering compacted snow over unharvested kale to preserve it like nature's freezer. Baltic fishermen traded amber for grain with inland villages, their shiny yellow stones becoming edible currency. In the Alps, where deep snow trapped valleys for months, communities positioned famine crosses at precise elevations when snow covered the cross arms. It signaled time to slaughter livestock before starvation weakened them too much for meat. Perhaps the most profound preparation was psychological. Folktales reinforced the morality of sharing, with stories like the Hungarian stone soup, where a clever wanderer convinces villagers to each contribute one ingredient, creating a feast from scraps. Children played famine games with acorn counters, learning to ration imaginary food stores. Even religious practices adapted. Some French parishes held barefoot masses during hard winters, where congregants removed shoes to empathize with the starving poor, reinforcing communal bonds. The genius of these systems lay in their layered redundancy. A single bad harvest might deplete grain stores, but famine crops could bridge the gap. If those failed, wild foods and fermented reserves offered stopgaps. When all else collapsed, social contracts and shared knowledge provided last resorts. Modern analysis of tree rings and harvest records shows villages employing these strategies suffered fewer deaths during the Great Famine than those relying solely on rigid farming monocultures. The lesson was clear. Resilience wasn't about stockpiling more, it was about planning deeper from the roots up. Medieval farmers didn't just endure winter, they engineered resilience into every facet of their lives, leaving blueprints for survival that still resonate today. Their strategies reveal a profound truth. Adaptability isn't about brute force against nature, but about dancing with its rhythms. Take the humble root cellar, a passive refrigeration system requiring no electricity, yet maintaining perfect preservation temperatures through precise earth insulation. Modern off-grid communities still replicate this design, proving its timeless efficiency. Meanwhile, the medieval practice of leaf hang, harvesting tree foliage as emergency livestock feed, finds echoes in contemporary permaculture, where agroforestry integrates tree crops with pasture to buffer against climate extremes. What's startling is how these medieval methods preempt modern sustainability principles. The circular economy. Peasants perfected it centuries ago, repurposing wool scraps into insulation, ash into soap, and even urine into leather tanning agents. Seasonal eating. Winter diets of fermented foods and preserved meats inadvertently provided gut-healthy probiotics and protein long before nutritionists branded these as superfoods. Even their social safety nets mirror today's mutual aid networks, where communities pooled risks rather than relying solely on individual stockpiles. The medieval gleaning hour has modern parallels in urban foraging movements that rescue wasted produce from commercial fields. Yet the starkest lesson lies in their cognitive resilience. Facing unpredictable winters without weather apps or supply chains, farmers developed hyper-observant relationships with their environment. They could read ice thickness by sound, predict storms through cloud formations, and calibrate food rationing by tracking daylight shifts. This granular awareness, now rare in our central heated, grocery-delivered world, offers a masterclass in situational adaptability. Modern preppers hoard freeze-dried meals, but medieval households cultivated diverse skills, preserving, foraging, crafting, and bartering as interchangeable survival currencies. The contrast with today's fragility is revealing. Where medieval villages stored resilience across community relationships, ecological knowledge, and multipurpose tools, modern systems often concentrate vulnerability in brittle supply chains. One winter storm can empty supermarket shelves within hours, yet a 14th century household could subsist for months on carefully rotated root crops, smoked fish, and fermented greens. Their true innovation wasn't any single technique, but systemic redundancy fail-safes woven into food, fuel, and social structures so tightly that no single point of failure could collapse the entire system. This legacy whispers urgent questions. As climate change amplifies weather extremes, could reintegrating medieval wisdom, like cold hardy crop diversity or passive thermal architecture, soften our societal vulnerabilities? Iceland's ongoing use of geothermal heated medieval greenhouses, or alpine farmers reviving traditional snowmelt irrigation, suggest yes. The deepest takeaway isn't about replicating the past, but recognizing how those survival frameworks, decentralization, skill diversification, and ecological symbiosis, remain revolutionary. In an age of climate uncertainty, medieval farmers offer an unexpected compass. Their winters were longer and darker than ours, yet their light never went out. Hollywood loves to paint medieval winters as unrelenting nightmares, years without end where peasants shivered helplessly beneath perpetual blizzards. The truth is far more nuanced. While the Little Ice Age brought brutal cold snaps, winters weren't universally horrific. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, reveals surprising variability. Some years saw unusually mild winters where vineyards flourished in southern England, while chronicles from Bavaria describe winters so warm that fruit trees bloomed in January. Farmers didn't just endure these fluctuations, they adapted with agricultural savvy we're only now rediscovering. Take the myth of universal starvation. Pop culture imagines medieval villagers scraping moldy bread crusts while skeletons lurk in the shadows. Reality was more strategic. Crop rotation systems, like the three-field method, ensured some harvest even in bad years. Fields left fallow recovered nutrients while alternate plots yielded winter-hardy grains like rye or spelt. Records from Normandy show farmers planting broad beans in autumn as living fertilizer. Their roots fixed nitrogen in soil while withstanding frost, boosting spring wheat yields. Even during notorious cold spells, communities near wetlands harvested nutrient-rich watercress year-round, and alpine villages cultivated microclimates where south-facing slopes trapped enough sun to grow winter greens under straw mulch. Another stubborn misconception, that medieval homes were icy death traps. While peasant cottages lacked modern insulation, their designs exploited physics in clever ways. Thatch roofs, often 3 feet thick, created air pockets that slowed heat loss better than modern asphalt shingles. Curtains of heavy wool or leather divided single-room dwellings into heat zones, keeping sleeping areas warmer than workspaces. Archaeologists replicating medieval home conditions found that a properly maintained central hearth could maintain temperatures around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, chilly by today's standards, but survivable with layered clothing and shared body heat. In Ireland, some cottiers banked their fires with slow-burning turf bricks that smoldered for days, a trick still used in traditional croft houses. The biggest myth of all might be the idea of passive suffering. Medieval farmers weren't helpless victims of winter, they were proactive strategists. Weather wisdom passed down through rhymes and almanacs helped time plantings to avoid early frosts. In the Alps, farmers built stone heat sinks in fields, dark rocks that absorbed daytime sun to melt nighttime snow, extending growing seasons weeks beyond natural limits. When the Thames froze, Londoners didn't just huddle indoors. They held frost fairs on the ice, setting up temporary shops and roasting oxen on makeshift spits. Adaptation wasn't optional, it was cultural. Even the darkest winters held pockets of normalcy. Court records from Burgundy describe winter weddings where guests sledded to church on polished oak runners, and Icelandic sagas mention children playing knuckly-bones on ice-locked fishing ponds. The stereotype of unbroken gloom ignores these sparks of life, proof that medieval people didn't just survive winter. They carved moments of joy within its constraints. Modern climate historians now see their strategies as case studies in resilience, offering lessons for our own era of weather extremes. The past wasn't a monochrome struggle. It was a spectrum of challenge and ingenuity, where every snowdrift hid a dozen survival hacks waiting to be unearthed. So what was the secret sauce of medieval winter survival? It wasn't just one tactic, but an entire ecosystem of resilience, where crop rotation danced with communal grain banks, where wool cloaks were woven with social contracts, where every scrap of salt and sunlight was hoarded like gold. These farmers didn't just react to winter, they anticipated it, turning limitations into innovations. Stored grains became seed banks, livestock doubled as fertilizer factories, and even the darkest months were repurposed for toolmaking and textile work. Their genius lay in seeing the whole board. A bad harvest could be offset by preserved fish, a frozen river bypassed by bartered wool, a sick neighbor buoyed by shared soups. Yet the real lesson isn't in the individual techniques, it's in the mindset. Medieval farmers treated survival as a verb, not a noun. They read frost patterns like textbooks, parsed bird migrations as weather reports, and viewed every resource as something with multiple lives. A single sheep gave fleece for clothing, milk for cheese, and finally, meat salted against famine. Nothing was static, everything cycled. Compare that to our modern fragility, where a power outage or supply chain hiccup leaves supermarket shelves bare within hours. We've outsourced survival to systems far beyond our control, while they embedded it into daily rhythms. So here's the question that lingers like hearth smoke in a winter cottage. Could we do it today? Not with our gadgets and grocery apps, but stripped down to ingenuity and community alone. Imagine trading your smartphone for a scythe, your thermostat for a peat fire, your takeout for a cellar of fermented turnips. The challenge isn't just about skills, it's about shifting our entire relationship with uncertainty. Medieval winters didn't just test physical endurance. They forged a worldview where adaptation was as natural as breathing. Maybe that's their real legacy, not the root cellars or woolens, but the quiet understanding that resilience isn't about avoiding hardship, but transforming it. What do you think? Drop your thoughts below. Could you hack a medieval winter, or would you be the first to start nibbling the thatch? And while you're at it, tell us which survival tactic amazed you most. Was it the squirrel for mittens, the fish storing snow tunnels, the lullabies sung to nervous livestock? The comments are your village square, let's get debating. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into how humans outsmart nature, don't forget to hit that subscribe bell. Until next time, keep your fire banked and your curiosity